So most of us haven't met in person for several weeks. For some of us, it's been a few months, and a few of us haven't seen each other since this pandemic started. So I thought it'd be a good excuse to try to reconnect with some of you from Narkis who I haven't seen in a while and find out how you've weathered the storm in general. But I also thought it could be a good excuse and an opportunity to give the rest of us a window into your lives and the work that some of you are involved in more specifically. So just last week, I met up with Corrie Van Maanen. Now, if you know Corrie at all, you know very well what a very special person she is. And you'll know too how much she doesn't like to be the center of attention like this. And I have to say, this is a sentiment I completely identify with. I remember when we lived in the States for a few years thinking, wow, this would be so nice. We'll get to experience new churches, sit at the back and be anonymous without the pressure of having to perform every week. Of course, it's impossible to be anonymous at church in America because you're always accosted by designated people armed with literature and invitations to sign up to every activity and email chain available. I think it's safe to say, though, that at Narkis, we probably err on the opposite extreme. You can probably attend for weeks, slipping in and out unnoticed, and that isn't healthy either. Critical issues and milestones can go unattended to and uncelebrated. So for example, just this June 5th, and I had no idea of this, but Corrie celebrated her 30th anniversary here in Israel. So at the risk of awkwardly exposing her to the limelight she generally tries to escape, I wanted to just reflect on a couple insights I learned from Corrie in our conversation last week. There are little pearls of wisdom from her work that normally goes on quietly and undetected, as it should. Yet, like a precious but delicate piece of artwork that has to remain concealed so that it isn't damaged by exposure to the light, every now and then you just have to bring it out for the benefit and edification of others. So to hear Corrie tell it, she didn't know exactly what she would be doing when she first came to Israel back in 1990. Corrie had studied extensively to become a registered nurse for mentally and physically handicapped people. And she said she felt God had given her the desire to go abroad, but she had no idea that the work she ended up doing would look the way it did. Corrie worked in nursing for a time, but as it turned out, she found herself utilizing her qualifications more as a door to broader work in home care to the elderly immigrant communities here, and especially to some survivors of the Holocaust. So what does that work look like? Well, as you know, Israel has fairly robust healthcare, but a somewhat less than adequate social welfare system that often only covers the bare minimum of a person's needs, and sometimes not even that. According to a government report this year, somewhere between a third and a fourth of Holocaust survivors, some 50 to 70,000 men and women, live below the poverty line and cannot afford basic goods. And then, of course, there are the intangible impoverishments that are not subject to mathematical measurement in shekels or goods. Many of the elderly survivors whose average age is 84 years old, and other immigrants like them, are here without family and have limited contact with the outside world. And if there's one thing all of us have probably learned over the past year of this pandemic, it is the enormous cost of solitude and loneliness. Maybe we wouldn't have denied it in the past, but where we probably couldn't have appreciated the magnitude of the forceful threat that isolation poses, we are all now certainly more acutely aware. And we're aware that none of us is immune. So you can imagine how COVID has only compounded this crisis for this particularly vulnerable community. Corrie's home care project was adopted and expanded early on by the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem, where she now works with a team of caregivers serving immigrants from the former Soviet Union as well as from other places. Corrie is, of course, trained and qualified to give care in myriad ways, including the very challenging rigors of physical care, such as bathing and feeding, that truly require a special heart, skill, and calling on the part of the person administering it. But a visit becomes just as critical when it consists of merely delivering goods and a conversation over tea. Often Corrie said to me, "It seems like I'm just doing shopping." I disagreed emphatically. Anyone by now should be able to see that this is life-saving work. Take a look.
Lunechka, how are you doing? This is Corrie. Yes. Did you go yesterday to the hospital? Yeah. Do you already need groceries? Because then you can give me a list and I will bring them soon. Baguette? Yeah. Okay. Deal. Vegetables for yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I love you a lot and have a good day. Yeah. Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye.
When everything is going well and smooth, work is done. But when storm is hitting hard, the whole world, but also Israel and Jerusalem, then visits and relationships, they become very meaningful. It's such a blessing for the time where we are in and the time as this, that we as a Christian embassy and a staff, we are here to reach out with hope, with faith, and with the assurance that the God of Israel is faithful and that He will care for His people in these days. And these people I visit actually every week. Once a week, and some already for many years, and build up a beautiful relationship, walking alongside with them through this crisis.
Shalom. Shalom. This is a gift from all kinds of people from outside Israel. And they wanted to bless you.
Yes.
Love you a lot.
Love is continuing.
Yeah,
Yes.
love continues.
Yeah.
Bye, sweetie.
But
Любим, спасибо вам, здоровья, удачи, счастья, благополучия в семье. Всего самого-самого доброго.
Я люблю вас, спасибо большое.
Of course, when possible, and safety precautions allow for it, Corrie continues to visit many of them inside their homes as well. You can imagine how being secluded from society has, for some, even conjured up some of their worst memories of the war era and the separation and loss it has wrought. One of her elderly friends she visits even told her the loneliness of isolation is worse than the fear of getting infected. In other words, loneliness can be an even more frightening prospect than death. No wonder some have called Corrie their angel, or that one thing they're waiting for is her visit. She's even asked them, what is it that they're waiting for you, because you're willing to listen, one of her friends says. He just needed to be heard, affirmed maybe, have his words reciprocated, or not, but acknowledged nonetheless. This principle of being available and not necessarily using words is difficult for someone like me. I like to deliberate or argue my way to a resolution, even if it's in my own head. The thought that one's mere presence through silence is somehow productive has always been hard for me to accept. But it reminds me of having gone to visit a friend of mine, a member of whose family died recently. Now, thankfully, in the Jewish tradition, when a person is sitting Shiva, the 7-day mourning period in their home, you're meant to go pay condolences by just sitting with the family for a little while and staying quiet. Now, it's in our Protestant DNA to scoff at most traditions, especially religious traditions, as having ossified, outmoded, or even harmful ways of thinking. It's not generally our predilection to consider that traditions can often be the repository of hard-earned and hard-learned lessons. And one of those is this one, that your average person is more likely to say something damaging than comforting to a person who is grieving, especially if that average person is left to come up with something to say on their own. We all want so desperately to be able to offer the perfect words that will be like healing salve when a hurting person is in their deepest pain, not realizing that this is often the worst timing, when even the most thoughtful words can come across as vacuous and insensitive, if not downright harmful. So I've tried to learn this lesson and keep my big mouth shut, but there I was sitting with my friend towards the end of the Shiva, and he started small talking about this and that thing in the news. I just nodded my head, that's interesting, I tried to say. But what he really wanted was the normal banter and arguing we usually get into about politics or whatever. Here I was trying to be agreeable and as consoling as I could, but he just said, that's not what you think. So we went ahead and had a good argument and about I can't remember what. And after about a good 45 minutes of that, he just leaned back in his chair, satisfied that he'd beaten me again, as he usually does, because he's much smarter than me, and sighed, I needed that. I've been sitting here in this room and I haven't had a good argument in days. When I left the house, I just walked away hoping I'd done the right thing. So it is comforting. It was comforting to hear Corrie talk about her work. And of course, most of what she does is so intensely intimate and private, sacred even, those conversations she has with people who have lived through more trauma than we could ever imagine, that she can't possibly share those stories publicly as object lessons. And yet, with such profound insight from those encounters, she still says, in the end, it's all about our hearts. Not what we write, not what we say, not what we do. It's the heart. Are we willing to serve? After 30 years of serving here, Corrie has a perspective that is the opposite of bombastic and pompous, a rarity for a country that attracts exactly that kind of person usually. She has a kind of confident humility that allows her to learn from the very people she's dedicated to assist in their need. Far from objects to be merely pitied or rescued, Corrie gives an example of a life-altering outlook she gleaned from one of her friends. Irina, not her real name, is someone Corrie has visited regularly for years. And even though Irina does have some family here, she hadn't seen them in months because of COVID, of course. She quickly recognized what psychologists have been saying is so dangerous about this isolation. I've always been needed by others and felt needed, but the moment you are not needed by others, what is the purpose of existing? Corrie immediately recognized that what Irina had expressed so well was that ever-present threat of depression and loneliness that, if we're honest, is potentially just outside anyone's door. But instead of succumbing, she attacked it head on. Irina did. She pulled her history books off the shelf, a subject she has had no previous interest in, and asked Corrie to buy her some notebooks so she could take notes. And in the evenings, Irina called her grandchildren who weren't exposed to history at the school they were attending, and she sat them down over the phone and would say, "Moshe, have you heard this story?" And proceed to just talk to them about the history she'd been reading about. Another of Corrie's friends put it this way: when nobody cares for you, you have to make sure that you continue to give. What an incredible life-saving insight. When you have nothing, you're at rock bottom, empty. Don't go on a desperate search to receive what you need. Give what you need. Give from your nothingness, from your emptiness. But how has Corrie been able to maintain this attitude of humility and a willingness to listen and learn as much as she is willing to serve and give? I want to suggest that she is embodying Jesus' message in the parable of the Good Samaritan. I've said it before, how Jesus' point in the parable is to give an example of the type of love, the type of action that will get a person into heaven. You remember the Bible scholar asked Jesus how to inherit eternal life. And Jesus' ideal model, his quintessential example of love put into action, is performed by this heretic, this apostate of an enemy. Consider the weight of that for a moment. The Samaritan's corrupt theology does not preclude him from starring as Jesus' exemplar of righteousness. You want to go to heaven? Do as the Samaritan did. But there's another lesson in this parable. Obviously, there's a glaring reversal of roles here. The men with correct theology abandon the injured man to his fate. It is not the men with correct theology who save a lost, heretical Samaritan. A lost, heretical Samaritan is the one who does the saving. And that's the other lesson. Are you humble enough to consider that there may be times that you may not be in a position to save, that you may have nothing to offer, that you might be the one to learn from someone else, from a heretic, that a heretic might save you? when you've been in this country long enough, maybe it takes a few decades, I don't know, you learn you have to discard many of the simple black and white formulas you grew up with. If you're looking with excited anticipation towards the Temple Mount, hoping your redemption will come in an earth-shattering apocalypse, while all the time worried that you might become contaminated by the world, there's a chance you might miss the kind of redemption Jesus was talking about. Jesus' redemption came about in small and larger acts of kindness and self-sacrifice that most definitely required us to get down and dirty and contaminated by the world. It requires that we truly internalize the commandment to love our neighbors as ourselves, not as others. That we not otherize those we encounter to the degree that we can no longer see ourselves in them. It means that we always, always, always see God's image in those around us, including heretics, including our worst enemies. Someone who carries God's image is someone who is always redeemable, who at least sometimes get things right, who even in his corrupted state might have something positive to offer. I hope you count many heretics as friends. I hope your relationship is such that you can speak openly and honestly with them, that they can speak openly and honestly to you. I hope you argue vociferously about everything that matters, if argument is what they like. And I hope you share in each other's weaknesses and struggles. I would like to hope that if we were in Jesus' story and we were beat up and left for dead on the road to Jericho, that we might not be so silent, that maybe we would even have the wherewithal to acknowledge what we'd learned and say, thank you, heretic, for what you've taught me. Thank you, heretic, for saving me.